It's funny because with it being infinite and seemingly not anchored to anything concrete in principle, we've seen what happens when that comes into collision with a similar idea, and that's the idea of being transracial now. We've had a few high profile instances of it, and it's had out and out condemnation and outrage from the same sort of people who willingly and unthinkingly accept that gender's on a spectrum and you can identify as whatever you like. And it's just funny witnessing them fail to, possess the tools necessary to argue against transracialism while at the same time upholding gender identity. Now, out of interest, how do you think that's going to? Are we going to move in a direction now where we're more confident in saying you can't identify as a different race and sex literally, or are we just going to start accepting transracial people as a sort of protected class now?
I mean, I think possibly neither of those. I think we may continue to regard transracial as verboten, but transgender as very precious and special. And I think the reason, I do talk about this in the book, and I trace the two are sort of theorized in different ways in academia, but I don't think that's the reason, like the fundamental reason why these two things are treated differently. But it's still instructive to look at the way that they're both theorized. So race and transracialism and so on is, in this bundle where it's very American in the specifics, but it's a historical sort of, white people have been at the top and other people are racialized, like white people are seen as not having a race, like they see themselves as not having a race. And that's one of the purposes of constantly talking about white people, is to get white people to notice that they have a race. Everybody else is racialized in that system. And if you want to work towards racial justice, you as a white person must be constantly aware of the fact that you too have a race and that you are in a privileged position in this racial and racially unequal and discriminatory world. And the most important thing would be not to allow you to identify out of doing that work. So if you allow a white person to identify as anything that isn't white, that person can then opt out of accepting their place in this hierarchy, in this racist society. So that's why I think they come down very hard on any white person who pretends, inverted commas, to be something other than white. Now, you could say all the same things actually about sex, because we do live in a sexist society. It always has been a sexist world. Men have been at the top and women at the bottom. Women are oppressed in myriad ways. And yet it's theorized differently. It's theorized within queer theory, in which everything that breaks boundaries is a good thing. Transgressing is seen in itself to be good. It's seen as a way to invert the hierarchy. You're playing, you're gender fucking, you're playing with the system. So a man who identifies as a woman is doing a liberatory thing within that way of thinking about the world. He's smashing the two boxes, the pink and blue boxes, and he's blurring the boundary between the two sexes. And these are seen as inherently good things to do. Now, these two ways of looking at the world are completely incompatible. They just don't mesh. And yet the same people think about race and sex or race and gender in these two different ways at the same time. And when you've managed to compartmentalize your mind like that, you don't notice. So you can write these extraordinary headlines like, Rachel Dolezal, if people remember Rachel Dolezal, she is a woman of white European heritage who identified as a Black woman and, got jobs that were specific for Black people. Like she worked for the NAACP in America, for example. And she became the target of global vilification when this came out. Well, there were headlines that said things like Rachel Dolezal has identified into a painful and complicated history that is not hers. She appropriated a painful and complicated history that's not hers. I just can't see how someone can write that and then not say, Caitlyn Jenner has appropriated a painful and complicated history that is not his. It's just completely parallel. Yeah. If you think one of these things, you should think the other, but they're compartmentalized. They're in different bits of the brain. So we have seen some cases of transracialism, and I think that these people are, in a way, they're kind of entrepreneurial, aren't they? They're taking an ideology and using it in a different place. But the mainstream of social justice, as it's conceived on American campuses and therefore, unfortunately, around the world in multinationals and in social media and so on, requires you to think of these two things very separately.
Yeah, I'm just going to jot gender fucking down as a potential band name, I think. But I've got a little theory that I think you may have got Professor Richard Dawkins in a lot of hot water over his comments on Rachel Dolezal. I think that tweet was possibly inspired by reading your book. 'Cause
I know
think,
it was.
yeah, okay, so I was correct in suspecting that it's entirely your fault, essentially.
Yeah, but he gets himself into trouble on social media.
He
It doesn't
does.
seem to worry him too much.
He
He did
does.
have a copy of the book before it came out, as you did, and that's how he was able to endorse it. And he tweeted a few times that weekend, like he tweeted the George Orwell quote. That's one of my two, front note quotes. And said discuss, I think. And then he did two other ones. I forget what one of them was. And then the other one was the Rachel Dolezal, like, why can Rachel Dolezal? Yeah. So I'm like, oh, you're reading the book. Oh, you're reading my book. Oh, that's where you've got to now, So
I connected the dots too. I think I saw the tweets first, then I read it in your book, and the penny dropped. Exactly the thought process Richard Dawkins had gone along there. But I mean, that's something worth talking about here, because he's a prominent public intellectual, somebody who's always taken somewhat quote unquote controversial opinions, because I think maybe because he's gone in hard on religion on many occasions. And what is it about this one thing, this topic in general, that has got him in so much trouble that we can't have a scientist can't have, not even make definitive claims, but ask questions about self-ID and gender without humanist organizations and atheist organizations? You'd think these organizations would be best placed to suss out tribalistic dogmas, but they seem to be enforcing it, and they've sort of taken his Humanist of the Year award away. He's been blackballed.
I loved that. It was a Humanist of the Year award from, I think, 1990 something. It was 25 years old. Yeah. And yes, I mean, the idea that, we have revoked this crappy little award from 25 years ago from a man who was a giant of modern thinking, I mean, as he I don't know if you saw the quote he gave to some British journalist, I forget which paper it was in. He said, I hadn't remembered I had this. I went to my CV to take it out and discovered that it wasn't there.
They'll be coming for his swimming certificates next.
I know, absolutely devastating. I mean, the idea that, Richard Dawkins wasn't casting glory on them with that award rather than the other way around. Yeah. I mean, who the hell do they think they are? That was hilarious. That was just the most po-faced, up themselves load of old toss.